Hello, folks. Well, it's that time of year again. Halloween is at our doorsteps, and so are those strange and spooky stories sent to me by our listeners. You know, the funny thing is, the majority of these stories don't even take place on Halloween, which is pretty spooky in itself. Strange things can happen anytime, anywhere, so lock your doors, draw the shades, light a candle or two, and throw another log on the fire, 'cause it's storytelling time. Story 1. Don't mess with the Ouija boards, unless of course you're willing to open up the gates of darkness, and once that gate is open, it's nearly impossible to shut it. You see, it doesn't happen right away, but it waits patiently and strikes when you least expect it. So when my friends and I decided to mess with the board one late October night, things were never the same after that. I don't usually run with the goth crowd, but I have some mutual friends that are into some pretty dark stuff. I figured it was all just a trend, so I sorta went along with it. Having no spiritual connections and being an atheist, I was open to the idea of the Ouija board. Besides that, a part of me was intrigued by it. Did it really claim to do all the things that people witnessed? Well, the four of us, which included Dylan, Danny, Kayla, and I, got together on that beautiful sunny afternoon. We went to a nearby park and shared a bottle of tequila. We weren't drunk, but had a nice little buzz going on. At one point, Kayla randomly pulled an Ouija board out of her backpack and suggested we go back to my place with it. At first, I was hesitant, but said why the hell not? It's the spooky season after all, and my parents were out of town for the weekend, so it would be just the four of us, free to do whatever we wanted. By the time we arrived at my place, it was well after 9 p.m., and nightfall had moved in. We gathered in the guest room, which was on the second floor and right across from my bedroom. Before we set up the board, Dylan fired up the bong and passed it around. I declined because I still had a buzz on from the tequila and didn't feel like getting crossfaded. Despite the weed and alcohol, we were all still pretty coherent. This was normal Saturday night for us, minus the Ouija board. We placed the planchette on the board and asked a few questions. Danny began with, "Are there any spirits in this house?" Dylan followed with, "Can you bring us some more weed?" Everyone laughed. I then asked the board, "Are you going to haunt me tonight?" almost provoking it. We waited, then continued asking more questions until boredom set in. We must have been at it for around 45 minutes or so. Of course, the board never responded as I expected. Well, the night went on and we went downstairs to play video games and eat snacks. I believe it was around 1 or 2 when we finally retired for the night. Dylan, Danny, and Kayla had all left, and I was heading to bed. When I entered my room, my head hit the pillow, and I was on the verge of falling asleep. But as soon as my eyes began to close, I remembered looking at the guest room across from my room, and the door was wide open, and sitting on the floor was the Ouija board in plain sight. I thought to myself, Kayla is so damn clumsy. Why did she leave the board in my house? Well, I didn't think anything of it, and I fell asleep. I awoke to the sound of a door slamming in the hallway. The guest room door was closed now. Were my parents home, I wondered. My question was then answered when I looked out of the bedroom window onto the driveway below. There were no cars in it. That told me no parents or friends had pulled up. So why was the door shut now? Well, I got up and slowly walked up to the guest room door before knocking. No response. I opened the door and was met with a draft coming in from an open window. The curtains danced around until I shut it. Perhaps one of us had opened it earlier, I thought to myself, but I specifically remember shutting it after the smoking session. As I turned to look at the Ouija board on the floor, I noticed something odd. The planchette moved. I froze immediately, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me. At that point, the tequila had long worn off and I was stone cold sober. I felt a chill wash over me in that room as the planchette rested directly on the letter D. Then without warning again it moved directly crossed over to the I, where it stopped. I remember taking a step back in horror as I witnessed the board come to life. I expected the planchette to move to the E next, to spell die or something like it, but it didn't. Instead, it shot over to the letter A, to spell Dia, D-I-A. At that point, I ran out of the room, down the stairs and out of the house onto the driveway. I was nearly out of breath when I looked up at the second-story window of the guest room and saw that it was open again. Like before, the curtains were flapping around, and the strange thing was, there was no draft or wind tonight. That was all I needed to be convinced that there was something evil surrounding the Ouija board. It was the middle of the night, and I had two options. I could either call my friends, parents, or wake up the neighbors to tell them what was happening, or I could just face my fears and take care of the problem myself. Besides, who the hell would believe me anyway? If anything, I would be accused of drinking or being under the influence if I had revealed to anyone what I had witnessed. So after a long moment, I mustered up the courage to go back into the house and start a fire. I knew what I had to do. We lived in an older Cape Cod-style home, which had a fireplace. We generally used gas to heat the house, but ever so often, we used the fireplace as an alternative. I gathered up some newspaper, kindling, and topped it off with some lighter fluid before igniting it. Next, I grabbed an iron fireplace poker and slowly climbed the stairs. As soon as I reached the landing, I was met with a cold breeze coming from the open window in the guest room. As I rounded the corner, I could see the curtains still dancing around the window, and the Ouija board was still on the floor where I had left it. I looked around the room before grabbing the board and the planchette and running downstairs. I threw the items into the blaze and watched them melt before disappearing into the flames a short time later. The board had been destroyed, and I felt a sense of relief. After a moment, I thought back to where the planchette had moved just before I grabbed it. It had rested on the letter O. It then occurred to me what the board must have been trying to spell out. Diablo. That was it for me. I never messed with the Ouija board again after that night. When Kayla asked for her board back, I finally fessed up and told her what I had done with it and that I had burned it. At first, she was pissed, but eventually let it go when I gave her some money to buy a new one. So going back to the beginning of my experience, don't mess with an Ouija board. They're an invitation to darkness and things we just don't understand. It may not happen right away, but it waits patiently and strikes when you least expect it. Thanks for sharing my story, Megan. Story 2. Several years ago, I was going through a rough time and found myself in between places. And by that, I mean I was homeless for about 3 months. This lasted from August of 2019 until early November. It's a long story as to how I got into the situation to begin with, but I'll spare you the details and keep things short. I was camping out in the woods located behind the gas station I worked at. Yes, I still had a job, so I wasn't completely useless. As you can imagine, it wasn't always easy showing up to work while pretending everything was hunky-dory at the old quote-unquote homestead. I saved up enough funds and was able to rent a room nearby around the time the cold weather began to set in. But in those 3 months, something really strange occurred that leaves me stumped to this day. Now, the section of woods that I lived in wasn't very big at all. If I had to guess, it was probably around the size of a football field. It was surrounded by open fields on one side and a busy interstate on the other, which is where the gas station was located. It was a great spot, and other than the occasional dog walker, I never really saw anyone else enter the woods. That was until late one night in September. I remember kicking back in my Coleman tent, sipping on some peppermint tea that I had just made while reading one of my favorite Richard Saul novels. I had just worked a full 8 and was ready to call it a night, until I was rudely interrupted by the sound of a man screaming some kind of gibberish, and it wasn't far off. Like I rehearsed many times before, I flew into action, turning off the overhead lantern, popping my shoes on, grabbing my bear spray, and then emerging from the tent. Having spent so much time in these trees, I knew the layout well, and didn't really need any lights to navigate around. The screaming came in intervals, maybe every 15 to 20 seconds, before going silent again. Each time I heard it, it moved progressively closer until the man came into view. He must have been 50 yards out or so, just at the edge of the wood line. Even though it was dark, the parking lot was somewhat lit, which is why I could still see the guy. He was there by himself, hollering up a storm. I couldn't tell if he was yelling at someone or was having some kind of mental breakdown. There wasn't anyone else around from what I could see, and the parking lot was now empty. But there he was, red beard and messy matted hair. He was tall, lengthy, skinny, shirtless, and without shoes. He had khaki shorts on, but that was about it. Nighttime temperatures had dipped to their lower 50s that night. Not the kind of temperatures you want to walk around in half naked. It was obvious the guy was off his rocker. Was it drugs? Was it a mental illness? I honestly couldn't tell. I remember whispering to myself, "Please don't enter the woods." And what does he do? The guy enters the damn woods. The screaming started up again, and if I didn't know any better, he was looking right at me, charging forward with anger and lawlessness. I knew at that very instant that I would either have to fight this guy or hide from him. "Choose your battles wisely, my friend," I remember saying to myself. And not knowing what he was capable of in that sticky state of mind, I decided to turn around and run back to my tent. There I grabbed my backpack and some personal items before fleeing the campsite. I couldn't afford to lose those belongings should the stranger come across them. He can have the tent though. I could still hear the man screaming and thrashing about in the woods as he made his way closer. But at one point, he just stopped and began speaking in tongues, or maybe it was just plain gibberish. Intrigued, I slowly lowered my belongings to the ground and moved forward in the location where I thought he was. He was standing in a small clearing, about 30 feet in front of my tent, but he didn't appear to notice it. It was at that point he did something that left me a changed man forever. Head cocked to one side, the stranger levitated about 2 feet from the earth. His arms stretched outward, as if embracing for a hug that never came. His body tilted forward diagonally in the most unnatural position I've ever seen another human being be in. After a few seconds of this, he dropped to the earth, and my jaw dropped to the ground. I was too afraid to move or do anything in that moment. Even after he casually got up and walked out of the woods, I must have stayed glued to that position until the wee hours of the morning. Had I just witnessed some kind of spiritual event? Was it divine intervention? Was it the devil himself? Or was the guy some kind of mad magician? You tell me. The only way I could mentally move forward from my experience was to convince myself it was the latter, that the guy had performed some magic trick in the middle of the woods, in the middle of the night. Why? I don't know. Drugs, mental illness, stress. It can drive a man to do things without any rhyme or reason. Thank God I never saw him again, but that burning question remains with me to this day. Who the hell was this guy, and why was he there? Let's just say I moved my campsite deeper into the woods after that eerie encounter, and I feel a little better getting this story off my chest. I chuckle to myself when I think about it now, but in the moment, it sure gave me the heebie-jeebies. Thanks for sharing my story, Rusty, and happy Halloween to ya. Mick. Story 3. I bought an old mirror at a yard sale last summer, and it wasn't until now that I began to put two and two together. Now that we're officially in the spooky season, I figured I'd share my experience with you and your listeners. Well, there was something off about that mirror. I say was because I no longer have it in my possession. In fact, I went out of my way to make sure it never sees the light of day again. The mirror wasn't anything special, just your typical bedroom mirror. It was old, but not an antique per se, probably from the 90s. It was long and slender, about 4 feet high, and about 1.5 feet in width. It fit perfectly in the small bedroom of my apartment that I shared with my roommate and his cat named Jerky. Well, after purchasing the mirror last August, I hung it above my dresser, and that's where I would leave it until I destroyed it in October. I have since replaced it with a new one I bought from Ross. So during the first week I had it, I had a random fly infestation out of nowhere. I blamed it on the unseasonably hot and humid Florida weather, and eventually set out some fly strips. The problem would soon disappear. Not long after, though, I began to have strange dreams about being sucked into the mirror, where a beautiful lush green forest awaited me on the other side. As I roamed the contours of this foreign land in my dreams, I felt freer than I ever had in real life. It was like a living fairy tale. The birds sang their song, tree limbs weighed heavy with fresh fruit, and the sun poked through the bright green canopy, casting tubes of light onto the forest floor. I stayed as long as I could in that forest until I woke up, and when I did, I was met with sadness and even depression, for I knew this was all just a dream. It was at that point I began to look at the mirror differently. Over the course of a couple weeks, I would make an effort to go to bed early, just so I can experience the hypnotic allure of these dreams. After the third time, I was hooked. The dream always began with me getting out of bed and dropping down into the mirror. After entering the abyss, I returned to that dreamy forest again, doing cartwheels and various acrobatic moves while singing some impossibly beautiful melodies. I never wanted to leave this place again. But after a while, I sensed a darkness that began to seep into my own reality. First, I found myself sleeping 12 to 15 hours a day, drinking and eating little, making excuses not to go out or socialize. I called in sick to work several times, and it's amazing that I didn't get fired looking back. I had become so consumed by these dreams that I had neglected my real life, and it began to show. My roommate was never home, so he didn't even notice the effect that this had on me. But his cat Jerky sensed the toll it was taking, and he attempted to keep me from going to bed at unusual times. I used to catch him staring up at the mirror in complete silence, too. His gaze darted back and forth, pupils dilated, as if he could see shapes moving inside the reflection or whatever. But one night, everything changed. The dream began like any other. I got up out of bed, and I fell into the mirror once again, and arrived at what I thought would be the enchanted forest. But this time it was different. There were no singing birds, no fruit, no sunlight. But instead, a dark blanket of fog awaited me, covering the now dead trees in a cold gray color that almost hurt to look at. And as I stood in the middle of this dreary place, I heard the shuffling of the earth from all around me. Distant at first, but then it grew closer, followed by the sounds of high-pitched laughter. But it wasn't the kind of laughter that brought joy or happiness, but instead, more of the mocking, evil kind, and it came from all around me, like hyenas surrounding their prey. The worst part, though, was the feeling of being trapped in this world forever. Sweat, panic, and fear consumed me, and I swore to myself that if I ever got out, I would never come back. Just as I felt my world slipping away, I suddenly bolted up out of bed and threw the covers off, gasping for air and taking a moment to realize I was back in the safety of my own reality and in my bedroom. I had never been so happy to be back to my quote-unquote boring life. Jerky was there too, surprised by my behavior. He had been lying next to my head the entire time. I threw on my shoes and pulled the mirror off the wall. I took it out front and dropped a rock on it. By the time I was done, the mirror was in 1,000 pieces, and I felt 1,000,000 times better. I swept the remains into a cardboard box, and it went out with the recycling. After that, no more flies, no more dreams, no more nightmares. My whole experience reminded me of a darker version of Coraline, and I'm still perplexed how a dream or a nightmare can feel so real and leave me sobbing like a child when I woke up from it. Looking back on my experience, I believe the mirror was cursed or possessed. The flies, the dreams, the false sense of security. It all led to something so sinister that I still have the chills when I think about it. Prior to this, I was an atheist, not just agnostic, but absolutely anti-religion of any kind. Let's just say I did a complete 180 after this experience, and now I seek spiritual nourishment on a regular basis. Cursed items do exist, and if weird things start to happen in your life, well, you may want to pay attention to what you bring into your home. I wanted so badly to reach out to the previous owner of the mirror from the yard sale, but they have since moved. I do wonder, though, if they had any strange experiences as well. Thank you for sharing my experience. Rachel G. Story 4. Something disturbing lives in the pond behind my house. I'm a retired veteran, and for the last several years, I've been renting a small place on the outskirts of Sacramento, California. The house is small, but it sits on a 10-acre parcel of land, which is why I bought it. It even has a small pond near the back of the property that my buddies and I occasionally go to hang out. But even on the hottest and most miserable of days, I won't go swimming in that water. It's always murky and full of parasites. I gave up on the idea of cleaning it or turning it into something years ago, but I wanted to share my strange experience surrounding that pond. It began with the disappearance of my cat Pumpkin last summer, and after that, some of the other neighborhood cats started to go missing as well. Around 3 or 4 over the course of several months. My neighbors and I, who were spread thin over several hundred acres of land, would get together following each disappearance to see if we could track them down. We set up flyers, trail cams, and even traps to see if we could get to the bottom of it. We found nothing each time it happened, and were consumed with disappointment and even anger. Something was taking our pets, and that something was going to pay dearly for it if I had any say in the matter. Now back to the pond. Well, late one night in November, I heard some ruckus coming from the back of the property. It was an animal in distress or something, but I couldn't tell what kind of animal was making those noises. It would only last seconds until the night fell silent again. By this point, it was just after midnight, but I was determined to find out what the hell was going on, and if it had any connection to our missing cats. I grabbed my maglite, my gun, and a heavy jacket. After leaving the house, I crossed through the backyard and entered a group of trees. At this point, I heard something thrashing. Actually, it was more of a splashing sound, now that I think about it. It was coming from the direction of the pond, which sat about 100 yards beyond the trees ahead of me. As I slowly approached it, I noticed a disturbance in the water, like something had just jumped in, or was pulled in. It wasn't a big pond at all, probably only around 2 to 3 full-sized Olympic pools, but the problem was you couldn't see a damn thing in there. A thick layer of leaves, dirt, dander, and debris covered the pond like flesh over bone. My skin crawled thinking about what kinds of parasites were in there. It stunk too, like the stench of algae and death. Well, as I slowly skirted around the perimeter of the pond, my light captured movement from the center of it. The debris field that floated on top of it parted as the water shifted, making a small clearing that eventually grew larger in size, and then it would stop as if nothing was there. The next sound I heard was that of me walking over something crunchy. Well, it didn't take long for me to realize all the tiny bones that litter the water's edge. There were dozens of them, some about the size of a toothpick, and others about the size of a Snickers. I felt sick to my stomach, and as I began to flirt with the idea of turning around and heading back to the house, something reached out and grabbed the back of my pant leg. The first thing I felt was the shock of the cold water, followed by something pulling me downward as if trying to hold me under. I fought and struggled to keep my head up, gasping for air, thrashing and kicking what felt like a solid mass below me. No matter how hard I kicked it, though, it would not let go. I lost both my gun and maglite during the struggle and had no idea where they were. The creature then grabbed the hood of my jacket and pulled downward. This actually enabled me to slip out of the jacket and swim for shore. In the chaos of the moment, I was finally able to leave the water, but before I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of it just below the surface. By then, my jacket was well on its way to the bottom, being pulled by something that I can only describe as a serpent with arms. And how did I see it? Well, my maglite was now resting at the bottom of the pond, casting a dim glow upward before finally flickering out. I didn't waste any time leaving after that. In those 2 to 3 seconds, though, I saw what may have been responsible for taking Pumpkin and my neighbor's cats. It was a large serpent creature, about 6 to 7 feet long and several inches wide. It had arms, too, that protruded out from the middle of it. I'd never seen anything like it. Physically, I was fine, but man, mentally, it took some time to recover from that. Fast forward to the following morning. I called up my buddies and told them what had happened. I didn't sugarcoat it either. I didn't have to. We all trusted one another. We brought more guns and lots of netting. Several hours of cleaning, and we were finally able to see the bottom of the pond, which was around 7 to 8 feet deep on average, and about 12 feet at its deepest toward the middle. We found and retrieved my belongings, but there was no creature. I'm sure by now it must have left the water. Was it amphibious by nature? Was it really responsible for taking our cats? I think it was. I've been back at the pond several times since then, and even set up some trail cams, but they never seem to catch anything other than raccoons or possums. That pond will always give me the creeps, but at least I have some clues as to what may have happened to Pumpkin and the other cats. I've never seen a UFO. I've never seen a ghost. I've never even had a strange or paranormal experience, unless, of course, you count this as being so. Thank you for allowing me to share my experience with you and your listeners. Happy Halloween to you and everyone listening. Kivan. And there you have it. I sure hope you all have a fine Halloween this year, and you'll hear from you soon. Good night.